And that was why there were a set of negotiations that began in 2001 after 9/11, called the development round, that was supposed to rectify those imbalances. But Europe and America refused, and it ended in 2015 nowhere. It was a total failure. We've now recognized that the international tax regime isn't working well. Multinationals are not paying their fair share of taxes. Apple and Google, for all their ingenuity, are even more ingenious in avoiding taxes. And they use the globalization to do that. And so there's an effort within the OECD to stop it. But not surprisingly, with the influence of the, OECD is the club of the advanced countries, and what comes out, originally the problem was we wanted more revenue for developing countries and emerging markets where the production was occurring. And what comes out, they get a piddling, and in return, they have to give up the right for digital taxation and any other taxation that was not specifically specified in the agreement. Fortunately, right now, it looks like the United States will not sign. It certainly won't ratify. And that will be the end of the treaty. And so we have to get back to the drawing board. The African Union has said the discussion shouldn't occur in the club of the advanced countries, it should occur at the UN. And so there's a big initiative to do that. I've already talked about the intellectual property regime being neither efficient nor fair. I mentioned the investment agreements, and the debt regime is also one which has right now enormous flows going from developing countries to the advanced countries. Repayment, interest rates have gone up, and they're facing crises in country after country, and we have no way of dealing with that. So rectifying these rules would provide development countries with more resources to invest and innovate and access to critical knowledge that would help close the large gap in standards of living and help elicit greater cooperation in achieving global climate goals. So, in conclusion, the current rules-based international trading regime is not up to the challenge of climate change, which I began to talk with, and the urgency. And the end of the neoliberal order on which the current system was based means that we have to rethink the global economic order. And I think that's a great challenge. We had a framework that we could fall back on. It wasn't really based on the neoliberal. It was really power. And as we saw when it was inconvenient for the United States, but it was a framework that we have. Now we don't have that framework. I think it's imperative to find an alternative. As bad as the current regime may be, the law of the jungle, having Donald Trump violate any rule anytime he wants would be even worse. So I actually think that we need an international rule of law that is somehow something related to a fair rule of law, or at least a practically fair rule of law. There was a false simplicity of the neoliberal rules, which the new rules won't have. And so I've tried to highlight the problem. It's just one second best alternative that might work. But there's a huge amount of open questions that remain unresolved.
thank you very much for a very stimulating and for some provocative discussion, but for others not at all. I'll open the floor now. We have a little bit of time for questions. So, are there any takers? I was expecting you. Miranda Xafa, please give us a question. Do we have a microphone? Why don't you come?
I will not get into the question of whether the neoliberal order has ended. But you talked about the distortion to competition triggered by the Inflation Reduction Act in the U.S. and the fact that the U.S. subsidizes companies to reduce carbon pollution, whereas the Europeans tax companies to do it. You mentioned the carbon tax, a border carbon tax. That is supposed to come into effect in a few years in Europe. It's not in effect now, but it will take effect. Wouldn't that solve the problem in that it would give the United States a strong incentive to impose a carbon tax at home so that they can keep the revenue instead of exporting it to Europe?
Yeah, what I said, I've been a strong supporter of the idea of a carbon tax, partly because of the political economy. It really incentivizes all countries to have either a carbon tax itself or a regulatory framework that is equivalent to a tax, because otherwise they're losing the revenue. What I try to highlight in my talk was, while I think that it is fundamentally a good idea, for developing countries it presents real problems. Both I talked about three: access to technology, the capital intensity, which puts them at a disadvantage, and the cost of verification and implementation. So altogether, my view is very strongly in favor of that cross-border adjustment. But I think it will have to be accompanied, should be accompanied, for the developing countries and emerging markets with provisions that make sure it's not viewed or is a protectionist measure of Europe against the emerging markets, which is what they view it today to be. And the Green Technology Fund that I talk about at the end would be one way of helping them so that they could compete and so that they could impose a carbon tax, and at the same time, they wouldn't see the cross-border adjustment as a green tariff. Local level would mean some global organization will thank you. 2009 everybody now talking about it as even if it was not a progressive it was a flat tax, the idea would be to go to it. And then possibly things like green technology that can also be redistributed towards the emerging, less developed countries for the infrastructure needed and the knowledge needed for them to develop that in a green way. So in fact, the burden of this goes to the north, but generally, this support makes the world global level. Oh, I like the idea a lot. I think it's the right, it would basically have the polluters pay and use the revenues to advance technology that would be uh, uh, available for everybody. And one of the criticisms of the carbon tax is that while rich may emit more than poor, the rich are better able to bear the incidence of the tax than the poor, and that it's been very hard to target some of the poor who are hurt the most, and that creates a political problem, like the Yellow Vest movement in France. And one of the reasons for, this is a little bit of an aside, but it's related to your question. One of the reasons for the Yellow Vest movement was that some of the poor regions in France, they had taken away the public transport system. People had to travel long distances to their job. They were poor and had less efficient cars, so they were paying more in gasoline and petrol. And so they felt the burden of the tax particularly strongly. And there was no, so the solution would have been to provide public transportation. And so the idea of thinking about how you creatively use funds like that to have public investment that is really equity-driven public investment and directed at dealing with some of the side effects of the carbon tax could make it more politically palatable. But the basic idea of trying to derive revenue from the polluters to create a greener world is, I think, absolutely right. But the political will is that's going to be a hard thing to do. But if you had a progressive Europe and America, they could do it together, and that would be 40% of the world, and that would make a difference.
Luca?
I mean, obviously, administering a fund is, particularly at a global level, is difficult. My sense is that the administration of scientific funds, technology funds, in general within countries is done actually pretty well. I know that the returns on investment in the U.S. in science and technology have been fantastic, larger than per dollar when you calculate it, larger than any other form of investment. Not perfect, and a main imperfection, for instance, when we gave a loan of almost $500 million to Tesla, which enabled it to survive. We would not have had the electric vehicle that it is, very successful. And Musk doesn't mention this very often, that he exists because of government, of this huge government loan. They made a mistake. They didn't. They took the downside risk, but they didn't take any upside, and they should have had a warrant, which means when the stock goes up, and the U.S. government would be a wealthy government by now if they had done that. But in general, we've done that in many when we lent money to in some of our other industrial policies. We've done that, and I don't know the full story of why we didn't do it in those cases, but I think we have now a handbook, you might say, of how to do these things better. And I mean, it's not perfect, but the private sector allocation of resources, look at the banks and how well they did pre-2008 in the United States, was not exactly efficient. So, the nature of human frailty is that none of our institutions are going to be perfect. And we have to think about, I agree, the last part of your question, we have to think very carefully, how do we create institutions that work? And no, I would actually, I know people don't like to proliferate funds, but I actually think diversification is good. And I think that in the area of technology, where you have more engineers involved and more, scientists, capture is more difficult. Not impossible, but I think the National Science Foundation, the NIH in the United States, these have worked actually very, very well. So and they allocate billions of dollars of resources every year. So I don't think they're perfect. I don't always agree with their allocations, but I think that they've worked in a way that it has been so far not really captured and been relatively efficient. So if we could get that kind of professionalism involved in this new institution, I think it could work. Well, okay.
Another question here. I don't know how much time we have, but maybe a few minutes. I see no new hands.
For example, if I heard in 2030, half of the ammonia consumed, for example, they found from green hydrogen, that was great. So my question is, quotas, as a quality tool, what does it keep into the second alternative? Rather, as an agent, now, for example, to stimulate private markets to promote innovation, to finance solutions that actually help us achieve the vision, other parallel from as a state.
Yeah, that's a great question, and at a very theoretical level, there's a lot of discussion about the uses of prices versus quantities, quotas, and Weitzman has a very famous paper where the question is, if you have to choose between prices or quotas, quantities, which is preferable? And there are a whole range of conditions in which quantities are preferable. The more general theorem is that where you can implement nonlinear or combinations of these are even better. The experience has been that quotas often serve a stronger role in incentivizing innovation. It's it's more behavioral economics. In terms of incentives, you could get in standard theory, one could often do with either. But it turns out, I think, that there is a lot of evidence that quotas are more effective. So the Indonesia example I mentioned, I had a dinner at the end of at the beginning of September with two of the former, with the current and the former finance minister of Indonesia, one of whom is much more neoliberal than the other. And just to be a little provocative, I asked the question, could Indonesia have succeeded in getting the development that it got in nickel with using tariffs and price incentives rather than the the strong action? And the current finance minister said no. And the other one tried to defend, but really couldn't defend the price system. And say, they've tried that and it hadn't worked. And so the current said she was well trained in American universities and knew that you're supposed to talk about prices, but she said the practice was that these quotas have really been more effective.
Okay, I'll take just two more questions. I think one back there and one over there. Yeah. Yes, please. Sorry, we have to. I mean, I'm limiting. It's a great privilege to have Professor Stiglitz, and he'd be willing to spend more time, but we have to finish at 6:30. So. Euthanasia was the euthanasia. Can you repeat the question?
Euthanasia.
The death of.
You mentioned many other things, but optimal advertising is actually the main goal of many so-called innovative firms like Facebook and Silicon Valley. So, would you say that the death of the advertising is creating more than the action? Is it based in innovation?
No. I mean, I was using that sort of Google. They're providing. Well, let me put it like this: they're providing services that at the same time that people want. The only question is the way it's organized. Say Twitter gives enormous power to controlling the town hall, if you want to think about it, the 21st century, the kind of public space, the agora, by a private individual is something that we should not have allowed. And when it was up for sale, it should have been bought, I think, publicly. And so I think we should. It would have been better if we had a more publicly oriented social media, for instance. But that's only going to be solving one problem in our society. It doesn't solve all our problems. Yeah.
Yeah, and if I may add, I think also one of the concerns with artificial intelligence is it might be used primarily at first to increase people's attention, to be able to advertising essentially, to promote goods. So again, the question is, do you use artificial intelligence and let the market determine in what direction that's going to go, or whether you have some ways of diverting that research in that critical area for medical purpose or something else. Yeah.
Yeah, I just came back from Marrakesh, where the IMF World Bank meetings were, and there, not surprisingly, was a lot of discussion of the role of money, financial sector, in promoting climate change. And let me, I think it can play a very important role. The fact that if money doesn't finance coal, doesn't, and goes to, say, renewable energy, electric vehicles, it can change our society. But I think what I would emphasize is, I think there's too much focus on the financial sector. And the financial, one way of thinking about it is, particularly the private financial sector, the sovereign wealth funds are a little bit different, but the private financial sector, isn't very good at assessing a lot of risks, is short-term in nature, is focused on private returns, not social returns, and climate change is long-term, highly risky, and is a global public good. So fundamentally, I don't think you can try to shape the financial sector, but it isn't going to solve our problem on its own. I think there has to be real collective action in this. And here I've talked about collective action in technology. I think one of the multilateral development banks, as much as I've criticized them, are actually doing have the potential of doing a better job in pushing green investment, but can be combined with work with the financial markets. But I would put more emphasis on expanding the role of the especially regional development green banks. New York has created its own green development bank. You don't think of and actually, Europe has a very successful EIB, European Investment Bank, is a very relatively successful bank, and it's focused a lot on green investments in the last few years. So any discussion of the private financial market, I think, needs to be complemented by a discussion of the role of these investment banks, of the multiple public development, green development banks.
Well, thank you very much again, Professor Stiglitz, for a wonderful discussion, and we hope to have you here again very soon.